At first glance, the answer feels obvious. History has always painted women as refined, delicate, closer to beauty and care. You imagine soft fabrics, careful grooming, maybe even a sense of cleanliness that sets them apart. But that image is mostly an illusion. Because medieval life didn't allow for the kind of hygiene we take for granted today. Bathing, for example, wasn't a daily habit, not even close. In the earlier medieval period, public bathhouses actually existed across Europe. People gathered there not just to wash, but to socialize. Conversations flowed, laughter echoed, and for a moment, cleanliness felt almost normal. Men and women both used these spaces, sometimes even sharing them. It was a different world, one where washing the body still had a place in everyday life. But then something changed, something devastating. The Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing millions and leaving fear in its wake. And with that fear came a dangerous idea, that water itself could make you sick. People believed that bathing opened the pores, allowing disease to slip inside the body. Suddenly, something as simple as washing became suspicious, even risky. Bathhouses began to disappear. Some were shut down, others fell into disrepute, associated with immorality and danger, and slowly, bathing faded from regular life. So what replaced it? Not cleanliness as we know it. Instead, people turned to partial washing, a splash of water on the face, hands rinsed when possible, maybe the neck if there was time. It wasn't about being clean, it was about doing just enough to get by. And underneath it all, linen became the silent hero. Undergarments absorbed sweat, oils, and dirt. Changing them was considered more important than washing the skin itself. A fresh layer of linen gave the illusion of cleanliness, even if the body beneath hadn't seen water in weeks. So when it comes to bathing alone, the truth is simple. Neither men nor women were truly clean. But this is where the story starts to shift, because hygiene in the medieval world wasn't just about water, it was about how you lived. Clothing, for example, told a very different story. Women, especially those in higher social classes, were wrapped in layers. Long gowns, heavy fabrics, tight-fitting garments underneath, all designed for modesty and status, not comfort. These layers trapped heat against the body. Sweat built up slowly, day after day, with nowhere to go. And washing those clothes wasn't simple. It required time, labor, water, resources that weren't always available. So garments were worn again and again, carrying with them everything the body produced. Men, by comparison, often dressed more simply. Fewer layers, looser fits, clothing built for movement and work. On the surface, that sounds like an advantage. Less fabric meant less trapped heat, less lingering odor. But that advantage didn't last long, because men lived differently. A large number of them spent their days outside, working in fields, handling animals, building structures, forging metal. Their hands were constantly dirty, their bodies covered in sweat, dust, sometimes even waste. Imagine hours under the sun, muscles burning, clothes sticking to the skin, and no real way to properly wash afterward. The dirt didn't just stay on the surface, it became part of daily life. Women, especially in towns or noble households, were often more sheltered from that kind of exposure. Their environments weren't clean, but they were controlled. Less mud, fewer animals, less direct contact with the kind of grime that defined outdoor labor. So if you compare daily exposure alone, men had it worse. But hygiene isn't just about dirt. It's also about care. Hair, for instance, reveals something interesting. Women typically kept their hair long, but it was rarely left uncovered. Veils, wimples, and cloth head coverings were common, not just for modesty, but as a kind of protection. These layers shielded hair from dust and debris, reducing direct exposure to the environment. Men didn't have that habit. Their hair, usually shorter, was left exposed to everything: wind, dirt, sweat, and over time, that made a difference. Because no matter who you were, one problem followed everyone: lice. They were everywhere, in homes, in clothing, in hair. It didn't matter if you were wealthy or poor, these tiny parasites were part of life. People carried special combs just to deal with them, running them through their hair again and again, trying to keep the infestation under control. But here's where a subtle difference appears. Women often turned grooming into a shared activity, sitting together, combing each other's hair, picking out lice, maintaining some level of order. It wasn't just hygiene, it was social, almost intimate, a routine that, in its own way, helped them stay slightly cleaner. Men, on the other hand, were less likely to engage in that kind of detailed care. Grooming was simpler, quicker, and often neglected. So while neither side escaped the realities of medieval life, women may have had a small edge when it came to maintaining themselves. Just a small one, because the deeper you look, the more it becomes complicated. And then there are the details people rarely think about, the quiet parts of daily life that say more than anything else. Take oral hygiene. There were no toothbrushes waiting by a sink, no minty paste, no routine twice a day. People improvised. A rough cloth rubbed across the teeth, twigs chewed down to soft fibers, powders made from crushed bone or charcoal, abrasive enough to scrape away debris, but not exactly gentle. And even then, what mattered most wasn't the method, it was the diet. As trade expanded, sugar slowly found its way into the lives of the wealthy. Sweet foods became a symbol of status, but that luxury came with a cost. Teeth began to rot, gums weakened, breath turned sour. In a strange twist, the richer you were, the worse your smile could become. Meanwhile, those with less had simpler diets, fewer sweets, fewer opportunities for decay. Their lives were harder, but sometimes their teeth held up better. And when it comes to this part of hygiene, there's no clear winner. Men and women lived under the same limitations, shaped by what they could afford and what they had access to. But then there's a subject surrounded by assumptions: menstruation. It's easy to imagine it as unbearably unhygienic, something impossible to manage in a world without modern products. And yes, it was difficult. Women relied on cloth, on improvised materials that had to be cleaned and reused. It required effort, awareness, routine. But this wasn't unfamiliar to them. It was part of life, something learned early and managed with practical solutions. In a world where nothing was truly clean, it wasn't an exception. It was simply another challenge. And while women were dealing with that, men were contributing to a different kind of problem entirely: waste. Chamber pots sat in homes, filled through the night, and in the morning, their contents didn't disappear into hidden systems or underground pipes. They were thrown outside, into the same streets people walked through every day. Public latrines existed, but they weren't always close, and they weren't always usable. So many men, especially in crowded towns, relieved themselves wherever they could. Alleyways, corners, open spaces. It became part of the environment, part of the smell that never left. The filth wasn't just accidental, it was built into the rhythm of life. And finally, the attempt to hide it all: fragrance. Herbs, flowers, oils, used not to create beauty, but to cover what couldn't be removed. Both men and women used them, but not equally. Women, especially among the upper classes, leaned into it more. They paid attention to scent, to appearance, to the small details that gave the impression of care. Men, particularly those outside noble life, were less concerned. Survival, work, endurance, that came first. Appearance came later, if it came at all. So imagine standing there again, in that medieval street, breathing it in, watching people pass. Who smells worse? The truth is, it's not one or the other, it's everyone. But if you had to choose, if you had to stand closer to one side than the other, it would likely be the men. Not out of neglect, not because they cared less, but because their world demanded more from their bodies, more labor, more exposure, more contact with the very things that made cleanliness impossible. Women, despite the limitations, held on to small routines, small acts of care that over time made a difference. And when you strip away the myths, the elegance, the romance, the polished images of castles and gowns, you're left with something far more real. A world where true cleanliness barely existed, where smell was constant, where survival mattered more than comfort, and where the real question isn't who was cleaner, it's how anyone lived like that at all.